That was amazing. That was really cool to see because, as you probably know by now, I work at GitHub, and seeing all the octagons drawn that well, I don't know if I could do that. Hi everyone. Hopefully you're all awake, and Max's talk eased you into things. It was really great to hear the history of CSS-in-JS, because I'm going to talk a little bit about how that influenced our approach to themeability and working towards dark mode. I used to live in Australia. I grew up in the UK and moved here and lived in Sydney for almost 8 years. And so it's really, really awesome to be back here for the first React conference in Australia. And so, yeah, I moved to, so one of the problems with this, though, is that because I moved to the States, I'm afraid that I do now spell color without the U. After typing it that many times in CSS, I decided it was worth that little bit of efficiency gain. So I work at GitHub. If you haven't heard of it, it's the American version of Bitbucket. Hi Atlassian folks, I know you're here. I'm the Director of Design Infrastructure at GitHub. What do I do? Good question. We'll talk a bit about that. I'm Broccolini on Twitter, and the potato is my spirit animal. And also I'm a designer at heart, as you can see by this incredibly skilled drawing of me as a potato here. So design infrastructure started as design systems. So when I joined GitHub at the end of 2015, there was no design systems team. In 2016, two of us formed the team full time. And then it grew and grew, and as you can see, it's kind of ballooned a little bit in end of 2019 and the beginning of this year. And it's going to grow a little bit more, so that'll be fun for me. So what is design infrastructure? It includes kind of these sort of four kind of focus areas. So I have engineers on my team that work on both github.com and also our design system. We have 2 Rails engineers and 2 React engineers. We have folks that work on Primer, the design system itself. And then we have designers and developers that work on the core experience of GitHub, so how design systems are used within the product. And I wanted to mention that, and if you want to know more about the team, we have a fun about page on our site, and where people put their sort of essence gifts, which is kind of fun. And all the stuff I'm talking about today, I'm a director now. I don't do all the hands-on code, probably much to the joy of my team anymore. But I want you to know that some of the stuff I'm talking about is often due to the efforts of collaboration on the team. So I wanted to start off with a quote on color. So I listened to this awesome interview with Cassia St. Clair. She wrote this fantastic book called Secret Lives of Color. And she says, colors are cultural creations. They're shifting all the time. Color is not a precise thing. It's changing, it's living, it's constantly being redefined and argued over. And that's part of the magic of it. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this sort of journey towards on themeability and dark mode. So thinking back to GitHub in 2017, there was only 2 full-time team members. We had some contributors throughout other teams that were helping with the design system. We had a lot of technical debt, and to be honest, still do. But especially with our CSS architecture, there was a lot to tackle with, and we were just at the sort of the early phases of introducing systems. And the stack that we were working with was kind of like this: utility CSS, or atomic or functional CSS, depending on your name preference. BEM-style CSS components. We were working with Sass, and GitHub is built in Ruby on Rails. So when we started to work on things like a color system in 2017, that's the world that we were working in. This is what GitHub looked like then, not a huge amount different. But you can see that you might notice that if you do use GitHub, that some of the colors are kind of a little more sort of drab and subdued. So in 2017, we had no color system. But we did have 2,449 hex values that were like not connected in any way, which is not ideal. So we worked on updating the site. We got rid of sort of drab, sort of like old, sort of dull colors. One of them we called our main like link color. We used to call Dad Jeans Blue because it looked like it was color picked from a pair of dad jeans. A dad did suggest that name, so it wasn't from me. We worked on improving our accessibility. Not perfect, but we significantly improved things like color contrast through this work. And we worked on moving those 2,449 hex values over to Sass variables so that we were sort of having some sort of maintainability. And we introduced new color scales, so a lot more range and steps in color and a sort of systematic approach and consistent naming to that. So the developer experience improvements we got were that we had variables, not hard-coded hex values, the ability to make system-wide color updates a little bit more easily, a more consistent color set, and the ability to lint against like non-system colors. And so our intention was to have these like system variables point to what we were calling functional variables for text and background and border, and that these functional variables will be what was actually going to be pointed to from our CSS utilities and our component styles and even our custom styles. So we were hoping to do something like this, where we would have like a component, it would point to those functional variables, and but what actually happened is that in a lot of places we were just directly pointing at those system colors. And even worse, we were sometimes pointing at a mix of those things. We also had a lot of color functions going on throughout the code base, which is not necessarily super bad. It's just not great if we're not bringing that back into that system. So we didn't have a great abstraction on top of our color system to work with things like theming. And around that time, end of 2017, we started to really feel like, utility classes and BEM and that are only going to get us so far. What we really wanted is more leverage. We wanted that magical hit, one line, code change, update all the things. And that we felt that we could get that from a componentized architecture. And so that's when we started to explore building our primer components library with React.js. In February 2018, I made a sort of proof of concept with style components. We hired our first React engineer in April and got going. And so the two main libraries we were using were style components and styled system by Brent Jackson. Well, style components obviously by Max, as we were hearing earlier. And like Max was talking about, one of the reasons that we wanted that is because we were having all of that trouble with CSS sort of leaking in unexpected places. We have had an availability incident because of something unexpected happening with CSS, so it's something we have to take really seriously. And we looked to CSS-in-JS for that sort of style encapsulation and being able to sort of more predictably work with styles. So as we started to build out this new component library, we started to think about where is this being used. And we started to think about things like theming and what are the sort of shared styles that we have over different sites. These are some GitHub websites, some built with Primer, some not, but we wanted to build a system that could be used everywhere it needed it to be. So we thought about which styles are useful across any website. Well, most websites really need some layout styles and things like that. There's often common components that most websites share, and they need probably an adaptable theme. And this informed how we started to divide up and sort of categorize our props for our components. And so this would look something like this. So all of our typography props get these these CSS properties available to them, and layout, or our layout components get these layout props with them. And then our theme included spacing and typography and color, and so we made arrays out of those color scales I showed you earlier, so that then we could do things like this and have kind of basically like utilities as props on our components. And then we started to think about how can we make, when we find that there's like common patterns in thematic sort of changes to components, how can we group those together? And we started to use the terminology scheme. We went for a lot of different naming for all of these sort of API names. We're now changing again and moving to variant, which is what's used in style system. So to try and put that all together, our theme is composed of fonts, colors, and spacing scales. Those scales are made available to components via the theme. And we find common theming patterns. We can define those as variants, or just define those in the component itself, looking towards the theme. And if you want to read more about this, I recommend reading Brent Jackson's blog post on the design graph. I think that finding a vocabulary that helps you with those sort of mental models about how you're sharing styles and helps you with how you are creating constraints and making decisions about component APIs is really important. But also, full disclosure, Brent is my husband, so I might be a little biased, but I found this way of thinking really helpful in how we work on components at GitHub. So, with the theme and those variants, we had a way to sort of brand different sites, because we can swap out that theme.js file and change it to different values. We had a way to have component variants, but we didn't yet have a way to have color modes like dark mode. So let's talk about dark mode in GitHub. So 11 minutes before I did a little Twitter search as I was preparing my slides, someone had already tweeted, "So, when's GitHub getting dark mode again?" And in fact, it was actually probably 7 minutes, but it took me 4 minutes to think to take a screenshot of this. We know that this is something that people want. When we tweet things like new features, people will be like, "That's cool, but yeah, where's dark mode? Come on." Poor Nat. And so another thing that I like to think about is, so Cindy Alvarez, I don't know if she's well known in the React world, but she works at Microsoft, and she's written a lot of books, written some books on like research and learning from your customers. And one of the things that she talks about is, you know, a good way to observe if a feature is something that your customers want is to see if they're finding workarounds. And I think that if we can look at 20,000 plus downloads of the Google Chrome plugin for dark mode, that's probably a good indication that, yes, people are finding workarounds and they want this. And it's not surprising at all, really, because CLI is often dark mode, and like text editors, you often get like different themes, and there's usually a ton of dark themes. And then you flip over to GitHub, and it hurts your eyes. So I want to talk about working with color in dark mode, if you'll indulge me a little bit of the designy side of things. So I think sometimes people think, like, what if we just like reverse it, just flip the colors? So this, imagine these, so 0 to 9 represents a single hue stepping through those scales that I showed you earlier, going from dark to light. So what if we just like reversed like what those colors were pointing at? And so I started to like experiment with this last year. I made a hacky sort of demo. You can check it out. It's not it's not the best design, and it's definitely not the best code ever, and it's definitely not very responsive. But I started to play with this and explore dark mode and theming. And I noticed that, yeah, it doesn't quite work if you just sort of reverse the colors. Some colors kind of work well. So, for example, the link color and the reverse color, just one step up, works quite good. It's like just a slightly lighter blue that actually works great on the sort of dark background. With icons, I found I needed to shift things another step. I found that to get the icon to feel that same level of contrast as it does with gray on white to having a light gray on black, I needed to shift the steps a little bit further. And with orange, which we use in our navigation, I found I needed to move that even more steps. So when I saw the navigation with the reverse color, which was like a much lighter orange, I was like, ew, I don't like that. And it feels actually really good just being exactly the same hue. That for some reason that bright color works great on a white background, and it feels good on dark. With the contribution graph, I found I needed to shift things even more. And so I actually really needed to change a lot about the colors. I needed to adjust the hues. I needed to really increase the luminance. And they were really just like quite a different color scale. I couldn't get the same colors from the scale I was using for the light mode to work in dark mode. And I think that one of the things that I had learned from working with our color system initially is that colors behind the colored background, other colors used in big objects near other colors, like really influence how you perceive that color. So that dark background really changes how those colors feel. And a really simple test of this is if you just look at something like black text on a white background and white text on a black background. I don't know if it will be super visible on these monitors, but white text on a black background often feels like it's bolder. It's taking up more space because it's influenced by the color behind it. Whereas if you just adjust that slightly and pull it back and make it gray, it suddenly feels more closer weight to that black text on white. So that's just like a really simple test of like color influence. I really like this sort of description of it, that dark mode is not an inversion, it's dimming the lights. There's still light there. And I would recommend checking out this Apple keynote from 2019. It is talking about iOS, but it is very relevant to working with dark mode on other devices too. They also talk about, I don't know if that's showing up at all, but there's some there's some great boxes on top of these blocks. But they talk about also elevation. And so if you think if you imagine you have a light source, that if you want things to feel closer to you, you want them to feel lighter, to feel more elevated, and things in the background to feel darker. So it's really interesting stuff, and if you want to nerd out on dark mode, then I recommend listening to this episode of Design Details. Again, talking a lot about iOS, but very, very relevant to working with dark mode. So when you're working with dark mode, you inherit all of the other difficulties and challenges or fun things about working with color. And one of those is about perceived color. It's really, really hard to measure that and really hard to get the sort of same effects. So Stripe did a really great article. It doesn't talk about dark mode, but it talks about accessible color. And that's really sort of highlights like sort of the sort of small range and how much testing you have to kind of do to get the right feel. Another resource is Reimagines Programming Design Systems. I read this page to page when I was first working with color, and it was super informative, and it has a good section on perceived color. And one of the things from history has like a sort of short section on like the history of color is Munsell's visualization, which is this color tree here. So what he did is he used human test subjects and a range of mechanical instruments and invented a very kind of a remarkably accurate color model. He divided the color space into hue, determined by the color, like red and blue, etc. The value, which is determined by the brightness of the color, like light or dark. and the chroma, determined by the saturation of the color or the purity of the color. And these dimensions are still used in representations of some representations of RGB color models today. And what he realized is that color had to have an irregular shape, that his model had to have an irregular shape to fit all the colors that he was finding. So the desire to fit a chosen contour, such as a pyramid, cone, or cube, coupled with a lack of proper tests, has led to many distorted statements of color relations. Essentially, color is not a perfect circle, and it's unfortunate that in many of our design tools and color pickers and things, we do represent color in these sort of neat circle shapes or boxes and stuff. And this is where, as developers, I think that we can work with designers and help them understand color better. I really think it's a value to be a developer when you're looking at color, because it helps you understand some of the math behind it. And I would encourage you, if you work with designers using something like Figma or perhaps Sketch have these types of things too, work with them to build plugins that help them work with color in a better way than just that sort of square box or circle. Brian Levin, who also works at GitHub, is working on open sourcing a plugin that he made to help work with dark mode too. So hopefully that will be available soon. So, recapping, what I learned is that some colors, move quite significant steps in the scale, whereas other colors needed to be adjusted quite significantly. And so, I don't think that you can just work with the same palette for both dark mode and light mode. And these are some of the swatches that were used in the GitHub iOS app that Brian worked on. So when we're talking about working with color modes in React and how we might arrange our theme, I think that what we will really need to have is an array of colors that we use on light mode and a new set of hues that we use for dark mode. They might be very similar in some ways, but you need to really adjust some of the colors more drastically than to be able to just work with one color set. And actually, what I think we all have is want to do things like what iOS does and have those sort of light high contrast modes and dark high contrast too. And what we also need to do is we need to have that abstraction, a better abstraction layer on color than we had started to do with our Sass version of this. Initially, we wanted to use more sort of presentational color names because we wanted that function. Okay, is it being used for text or background so that we could tell how color was being used? But we wanted to stick with things like red and green and blue because through working with utilities, we had hit those sort of problems where people were like, is it info or link? I can't remember, but I remember that it was blue, so I'm going to use that class selector. But if we want to achieve color modes and swap out the theming as well as have those color modes, I think we need that abstraction layer. So we're kind of out with the presentational and in with the functional color names. So instead of variant green, we'll have things like variant success. If you want to check out more about those ideas, the way that we have constructed those files are based on the spec from Theme UI, as mentioned earlier. So how are we going to get this stuff into GitHub.com? So we're still working in Rails, but we are now, one of the engineers that's joined my team built a model of a component for Rails. So if you're like me and you're working across different code bases, I know this is a React conference, but if you are working across different code bases and that happens to be Rails, this might be something you're interested in. And he's actually been working with us and modeling our same React component API, but in Rails. So, and also we work in the open. We open source our design system and we try and work in the open as much as possible. Recently we we're working on a redesign of our octagons, if that's something that interests you. So you can follow along on how we work with theming in our React components by checking out the Primer components library, or how we'll apply this with things like CSS variables in our CSS library, and coming soon will be the Rails implementation of that. So I wanted to wrap this up with some other cool color quotes. So I feel like I can't do a talk about color without referencing Joseph Albers. He wrote Interaction of Color. And this statement really holds true to me, that color is the most relative medium in art. When I was working with color initially, and now as I'm starting to explore it for dark mode, there are so many things that influence how that color is perceived. There's only so much that we can control. We can control like what the palette is, and we can control that the composition of the page, kind of. Things obviously change with different people's data. But we can't necessarily change the context that people are viewing that UI in. They could have different accessibility settings on their computer that are changing the colors. They could be looking at your website on their phone and there's light shining on it. And we can't change the observation. We can't change whether someone's preference to certain hues is because of their personal background, their age, or the mood that day. And we can't control whether they have things like color deficiencies, like red-green color blindness. So color is very relative, and I think that's worth keeping in mind, because it's really, really easy to go down many rabbit holes and try and get that sort of perfect color system result. I definitely went down some rabbit holes. And so I wanted to end with a quote by Voltaire, that perfect is the enemy of good. Don't let, sometimes the difference between like good and great is not worth it. Don't let something good get in the way of not shipping it. It doesn't have to be perfect straight away, like Max was saying earlier, shipping earlier and often. Get that stuff out there. And thank you very much.